Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for Bipartisan Policy Center's event focusing on higher education affordability. I'm Bill Hoagland, Senior Vice President here at the Center, and I have the pleasure of working with our financial staff, our education staff, and health policy staff. Just since 2007-2008 academic school year, tuition, fees, room, and board have increased nearly 20%. These rising prices stem from funding challenges, many times at the state and government level. Historically, states have been primarily financiers of higher education, but state appropriations have declined by nearly 12% per full-time student since 2000, as the states themselves have had to wrestle with Medicaid, criminal justice, infrastructure, public health expenditures, among other state priorities, and of course, all complicated by the economic recession brought about by the pandemic. Today's conversation will address how states and the federal government can act together to chart a more sustainable future that improves access and affordability throughout the higher education system. In 2020, there was a higher education task force that we established here at the Bipartisan Policy Center that was led by former Congressman and Chairman of the House Education and Labor Committee, Representatives George Miller and Buck McEwen, and they recommended an annual $5 billion flexible matching grant to incentivize states to invest in higher education. Today's event also coincides with the release of a brief by the BPC staff, Marietta Abron and Shai Akabas, entitled A Moderate Approach to Free College. The brief details and the task force's proposals to reimagine that relationship between the federal government and states to finance is available on our website. With this proposal, every state dollar invested above a 3-year rolling average would have been matched by $4 in federal assistance. We asked the National Center for Higher Education Management System to model this proposal, and we found that over 10 years, the program would generate $20 to $60 billion in federal and state revenues. The issue brief, as I said, and the task force's 2020 report are available on the BPC website. We are honored to have Senator Collins and Reed join us later in the program to discuss their Partnership for Affordability and Student Access Act, acronym PASS. That proposes a similar pathway for states to maintain or increase their higher education funding. Finally, BPC is grateful to Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for their support of this event and today's issue brief. With that, let me introduce Amy Lloyd, as Acting Assistant Secretary and Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy and Strategic Initiatives in the Office of Career, Technical, and Adult Education at the Department of Education. She'll provide us with some opening remarks for our discussion today. Acting Assistant Secretary Lloyd oversees the office that administers and coordinates programs related to adult education and literacy, career and technical education, and community colleges. Prior to her appointment by President Biden, she was Vice President at Jobs for the Future and Director of Education at Cook Inlet Tribal Council. We are grateful to the Acting Secretary for agreeing to join us today and to speak of the Biden administration's higher education priorities. So with that, Secretary Lloyd, I turn it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me here today to speak with you all. As you know, President Biden believes deeply in uniting this country. I know there are so many important conversations at the Bipartisan Policy Center that bring people together. And as national concern about the affordability of and equity in higher education remains top of mind for so many families and students across the country, I know that many of the people in this virtual room have spent a lot of time thinking about and working on solutions and partnering with diverse groups of stakeholders that bring a range of perspectives to it. Here at the Department of Education, we believe that tackling the issue of college affordability is a goal that we can all get behind. As Dr. Jill Biden says, any country that out-educates us will out-compete us. And we all know that in today's global and technology-driven economy, post-secondary credentials are all the more important for our learners in order to be competitive in our labor market and help drive our economy as we build back better. And we know that we need to remove barriers facing students in accessing and completing those credentials. So it's not surprising then that embedded in, and really a critical component of this administration's Build Back Better agenda, is a strategy for higher education that focuses on both making college more affordable for students while also building the capacity of institutions to serve those students well, so that they have the supports they need to complete their degree and credential and find a quality job when they graduate. So on the access front, President Biden's American Families Plan would put an associate degree or certificate in reach for all Americans, regardless of income, by providing them with 2 years of free community college. 100 years ago, the high school movement rapidly expanded access to secondary education, and that laid the groundwork for innovation and economic growth. Today, we know the needs of the economy have advanced, and Americans need and deserve opportunities to build their skills to contribute to and share in the benefits of expanding the economy. And I'm sure I don't have to tell this group that increased educational attainment increases earnings, with associate degree holders working full-time earning about $260,000 more than high school graduates over their working careers. So what does this mean for our higher education system writ large? The proposal envisions a new partnership between states and the federal government, where each level of government bears some responsibility for financing these investments. In this partnership, the federal government steps up to do more to keep costs low for students, providing at least 75% of the cost for states and at least 90% for tribes, but also asks state to do their part, not just in terms of additional and sustained financing, but also to align their K-12 and higher education systems and to pursue other critical reforms. So we have done the math, and if all states, territories, and tribes participate, about 5.5 million students would pay nothing in tuition and fees. It's of particular note during this time of falling enrollments at community colleges that we know that initiatives that clearly communicate that students can attend college tuition-free have had particularly large impacts on enrollment. In addition, as part of our affordability efforts, we've also proposed 2 years of subsidized tuition for students from families earning less than $125,000 at an HBCU, TCU, or MSI. Doing so will help tackle long-standing inequities in higher education. Finally, we've proposed a $1,875 increase in the maximum Pell Grant, which is an enormous first step toward the president's commitment to double the Pell Grant, which would of course serve students at institutions in all sectors. We know that both tuition and non-tuition costs often stand in the way of a student enrolling in or staying in college, and these proposals combined will put these programs within reach for many, many more students. And all of that's just on the access and affordability side. We also want to complement increased access with evidence-based retention and completion strategies. The American Families Plan includes a $62 billion investment to create a new competitive grant program that funds evidence-based wraparound services and student supports, particularly targeting underserved students at public and nonprofit institutions. So these wraparound services can range from childcare to mental health services, faculty and peer mentoring, emergency basic needs grants, and more. And I know that the theme of today's convening is federal-state partnerships. And this is another area where we're leaning into a long-term partnership with states. We envision these dollars going to states and tribes through a formula that accounts for low-income students enrolled in both public and nonprofit colleges, but it would then fall to states and tribes to give priority in allocating those funds to underserved institutions serving low-income students. They would submit an application that describes that allocation, their plan to adopt promising and evidence-based practices, their benchmarks and evaluation plans, and an equity audit of higher education financing. This investment will ensure that more students, especially those from underserved backgrounds, will not only enter, but also persist and complete the post-secondary credentials that we need. And I want to pause here to underscore that last point. A dedicated funding stream like this, in partnership with state commitments to pursuing quality reforms, could change the game on college completion. There are a range of successful models, but interventions that have a large impact on completion rates have never been brought to scale. New attention and dollars will both allow states and schools to get serious about evaluation and scale and move the ball on this completion agenda and goal that we all share. Finally, we want to build the operational capacity of institutions, particularly community colleges, to serve our students and connect them to jobs. The American Jobs Plan also includes both a new community college training partnerships program, building upon the successes of the previous TACT programs, to increase the capacity of our community college system to deliver workforce programs that lead to good jobs. This will be a critical $12 billion investment over 5 years to ensure that those campuses have both the technology and updated facilities needed to serve their students. These capacity building investments will give our community colleges the resources that they need to best train our future workforce. So we know that as we begin to reemerge from the pandemic, we must seize this opportunity to build the systems that we need to more effectively serve our learners and workers. We know that the pandemic has exposed, deepened, and widened the inequities that frankly have been longstanding in our education and workforce systems, and done so largely along race and class lines. This plan serves those who need it most. Students juggling work and life along with school, students who are supporting their own children's education, students who are experiencing poverty and weighing the option of education versus another part-time job to pay the bills, students who are English language learners and immigrants to our country, students who may be incarcerated or who are in reentry following incarceration, students from communities of color. All of these are an essential focus for us as we urgently work to meet the President's commitment to advancing racial equity. It doubles down on investments in schools that serve those students and bases those investments in evidence. So this is truly a once-in-a-generation moment that we're in right now, with historic investments and opportunities for us to collectively drive the reimagination of our higher education system. In this moment, we can't just go back to normal. We must do better for our students. We must restructure our financing systems to make college more affordable, to reduce student debt burdens, to improve our completion rates, and close the racial disparities and other equity disparities in access and completion. But we know that we can't do that alone. And we know it's going to take a close partnership with states and institutions to make that bold vision a reality. That's why I'm so glad that BPC is holding this conversation today and that we're all collectively putting our minds to it together. So thanks so much for having me here today. On behalf of the Department of Education, I really appreciate your leadership in this space.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Secretary Lloyd. I appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule to be this afternoon and share those thoughts with us. At this time, it's going to be my distinct honor to introduce Senators Susan Collins and Senator Jack Reed and our moderator, Danielle Douglas Gabriel. I know firsthand how difficult it is for the two senators to spare the time with us, particularly today, with the Senate considering the bipartisan infrastructure legislation that I know Senator Collins particularly had a major hand in crafting. Thank you. Quickly, both senators are in their 5th term, Senator Collins from Maine and Senator Reed from Rhode Island. And I had the pleasure of working with them and their staffs many years ago. And since we are talking about affordability, Senator Collins received her degree from St. Lawrence University, where today, Senator, if I understand correctly from their website, tuition, fees, room, and board total $73,000. Unbelievable. Now, for Senator Reed, I can't make that comparison. Since he is a graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point, where there is no tuition, but he repaid that schooling with 8 years of active duty service and continues today in service to the country as the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. Thank you very much,
Thank you,
Chairman. They're going to be, our moderator is Danielle Douglas Gabriel, and she'll moderate the rest of today's event. Danielle is a reporter at the Washington Post who has written extensively on college affordability and state and federal higher education policy. Thank you, senators, for joining us. And Danielle, I turn this over to you. Thank you, senators.
Thank you so much for joining us today, both Senators Reed and Senator Collins. I'm curious, what drew you both to the issue of college affordability, and why did you decide to work together on the issue?
before gentlemen. Before I was elected to the Senate, I worked at Hudson University in Bangor, Maine. And most of the students at Hudson were first generation college students. Virtually, I think it was 85 or 90% of the students had either student loans or Pell Grants or work study assistance that enabled them to be there at Hudson. And Hudson also made a tremendous effort to keep its tuition and other fees more reasonably priced. But even then, I saw the constant tug and struggle that these students experienced between getting a job and going on to complete their education. And in many cases, they came from families with no experience in higher education. And many times the parents would say to them, why are you accumulating all of this debt? Why don't you get a job right now? And it was difficult for them. So, one of the very first bills that I introduced as a brand new senator in 1997 was a College Affordability Act, and it provided a tax break for the interest paid on your student loan debt.
Well, I was very fortunate to go to West Point, but my sister and brother, my contemporaries, all seized upon college as the way to go forward in terms of not only their own personal careers, but to contribute to the community. So to me, college was just critical. It was the difference between being able to secure a well-paying job and also to be a participant in the community. And I must add too, as the heir to Senator Claiborne Pell, we had a legacy in Rhode Island of commitment to education, and I wanted to continue that tradition. And even today, I should say it's even more important in education. We're moving from an industrial age, we've moved that to an age of ideas, of intellectual capital rather than bricks and mortar capital. And college now is not just something nice to do, it's absolutely essential. When I graduated from high school in 1967, was a reasonable choice if you wanted to go start working in a factory and work your way up and you'd have a lifetime job and stability, et cetera. That really doesn't exist today. So education is even more critical. And both Susan and I formed a working relationship when we arrived together in 97, both committed to raising the ability to access college and making it more affordable, more accessible.
Act. How would this act help improve the affordability of higher education?
Shall I begin? I will. Well, first of all, it builds on the work that Susan and I both did in 1998 when we passed the LEAP Act, which was a state-federal partnership to provide support for students with financial needs particularly. It thrived for several years, but in 2010, with the budget debacle, we lost it. So in a way, we're trying to reconstitute LEAP in the PASS Act. What it does, it would provide federal resources, which we match by local resources, $2 of federal resources, $1 of local resources. Half the money would have to be committed to a need-based assistance for students, but the other half could be used for innovative approaches, for example, bringing different schools together. And then I think the big thing too, it would require the states to put together a plan that would link their elementary education, their higher education, and the job market. Because I think one of the mistakes we've made over the past, we haven't paid enough attention to what kind of students are we producing. Are there jobs for them? Will they move out into successful jobs? And that's the essence, I think. Susan?
I would just add a couple of comments. Senator Reid and I have worked really hard on this issue for a number of years, as he's mentioned. And a good example of the kinds of partnerships that we are talking about can be found in the state of Maine. There is, for example, in northern Maine, where I'm originally from, the Aroostook Aspirations Program. And it's a community-based program that works with the colleges in northern Maine to provide internships and assistance to students so that they see the link between getting the skills and education that they need and a future job that will allow them to stay where they want to be in northern Maine. Another example of the kinds of partnerships that our bill would promote can be found at Eastern Maine Community College and its Student Success Program. In addition to the problem of making sure that students get the advanced education and skills that they need for the jobs of today and tomorrow, we have a real problem with retention. And a lot of students are ending up in the worst possible situation of not finishing their education, so they don't get the credential they need, and yet they're burdened with the debt. Well, Eastern Maine Community College has a wonderful program called the Student Success Program. And for first year students, there's 2 weeks of intensive tutoring and in mathematics and English. And then there's a student success center that they can come to no matter what obstacles they're encountering to going to school. It might be that they don't have money for childcare or to repair a car, or it may be that they need more tutoring or they need mentoring. And this program has helped to improve the retention and completion rate of this community college. It's been a real success.
A quick follow-up to our questions about the PASS Act. One of the things that I think has been a challenge for a lot of state and federal partnerships is when states face budget shortfalls. How does your bill account for the possibility of those shortfalls? And then another part, and I'm really happy that Senator Reed mentioned the LEAP program, which was a very critical program to create a foundation for scholarships. How do you prevent what happened to the LEAP program in terms of the appropriations from happening to your legislation if it were successful?
Well, we both have a lot more seniority
Yeah.
now, and that certainly helps. We're both members of the Appropriations Committee, and that's important as well. So my hope is that we'll be able to keep the funding going. The bill does require, as a condition of receiving federal funds, that there's a maintenance of effort. In other words, that you can't substitute the new money and cut back on the state commitment. And I think that that is important. I remember years ago, many years ago, having a discussion with the president of St. Lawrence University, where I went and where I learned the shocking figure today from Bill Hoagland about what the tuition and other expenses, room and board, et cetera, are now. It's $73,000. I mean, that's just outrageous. And I remember asking this president, I said, I'm working really hard to increase Pell Grants. And I feel like every time I increase Pell Grants in an attempt to expand access for students, you increase tuition and wipe out the good that I've done with Pell Grants. And so this is an issue, and that's why we have this maintenance of effort provision in the Reed-Collins bill.
I think one other aspect of this is that there's a much more intense appreciation of the overwhelming cost of college and how it inhibits people from many things, taking the job they really want and prepared for because they just have to pay off their debt, being saddled with significant debt for years and years and years, unable to buy a home because that clouds their credit records. So I think there's more of a sensitivity now to bringing within college costs in. And in addition to requiring the states to maintain their effort, there are other things we can do. I've been sponsoring legislation that would actually require schools, both public and private, with high default rates to shoulder some of the burden of the default rate, not just pass it on to the federal government. And I think that would act in also as an incentive for these institutions to ensure that their curriculum prepares their students for real jobs. And that's another aspect, I think. There's just no one solution to this. But getting this program revived would be critical, and keeping it funded, as you point out, would be also critical, and we will endeavor to do that. But we're at a moment now where both the administration and I think many, if not all of my colleagues, understand that without this higher education, effective higher education, we will fall behind the world, both in an economic sense and indeed in a national security sense.
There's another proposal that the Bipartisan Policy Center has been pushing for that I think makes a lot of sense. And that is that you would link student loan repayments to income
Mhm.
levels. So as you go on into your career and you make more money, the amount that you would pay to pay off your student loan would increase so that it would be a graduated rate that reflected your advancement in your career.
If I can add something also too, and it isn't by a way of expanding on the introduction that I didn't pay for college. Uh, Leaving West Point and spending 8 years in the United States Army was a way to pay for college. And we have to do more of that. We have to create opportunities for young people to go off and pay back through public service their educations. It's been remarkably successful in the context historically of our military academies, but it should extend much more comprehensively so that if someone goes into a teaching in challenging schools and they work for a certain number of years, they can start receiving the benefits by the reduction of their loans, eventually, perhaps all of them. And we've got a situation where we have a better education system and we have people who can participate in our economy. And so that's another aspect of this complementary approach, not just one solution, but multiple solutions.
The PASS Act, I think, envisions a federal state partnership for higher education that goes beyond free tuition at community colleges and MSIs and the like. Why is that important to you?
Mhm.
Well, I think it's important because, from my perspective, a flaw in the free community college program is there may be a student who doesn't want to go to the community college, that who instead wants to go to the local university or a liberal arts college or a trade program. And it doesn't, it seems to me to limit choices. That's why I would prefer to pass the PASS
Mhm.
Act and to also increase Pell Grants and make Pell Grants usable year round. And also, I look at our Senate offices that have student loan forgiveness programs for our staff if you're willing to work for a certain amount of time. So building on Jack's idea that you could expand loan forgiveness in return for certain kinds of public service jobs so that students don't feel that they have to go into a particular field because that's the only way they can pay off their debt. So I think there are a lot of creative ideas.
Well, I agree. And I would like to see these ideas be complementary so that if you, in fact, raise the Pell Grant, And right now, well, let me go back to when Senator Pell passed it. It covered 80% of the tuition of a state school. Now it covers roughly 30%. If we can get back to that ratio, then individual students have a better choice of what they want to do. But if we can also make our community colleges virtually free, that's an option for many people that they'd love to take up. We've seen that in Rhode Island. Our governor did that before this federal initiative. But the point is, and I think Susan stressed it, is we have many different aspects. We have to make them complementary so that a young person can decide they want to go directly to college or they want the 2 years in community college, and they can afford to do both. And then we have to make sure that our efforts are leading to real skills that can be used in the workplace. And one of the things I think we've missed over the years is I describe it this way: we sort of have a supply model when it comes to education. We've always been turning out teachers, so we'll keep turning out teachers. We've always been turning out this type of student, et cetera. I think we all have to be sensitive to what are the jobs of the future? What skills will they require? How can we ensure that all students have a fair chance at good work? And that means, and part of our legislation ties in not just higher education, but also ties in the workplace. And the notion of federal participation, we crossed that great divide with Senator Pell in 1965 when we said we are going to contribute to the higher education of Americans.
I just want to add a comment to what Jack said because I think it's so critically important. And that is in my state and his state, we've seen a lot of factories close and people who thought they were going to have lifelong jobs be displaced in our paper mills, our textile mills that used to exist, our shoe factories that are gone. And we need to help reskill people. And that's why I've always supported the trade adjustment assistance educational programs that allowed individuals with federal assistance to go back and learn a new skill. And community colleges have been absolutely critical in that area, but so have our university systems. And that's really important. I think oftentimes when we talk about college, the focus is on someone just coming out of high school. Well, it may be someone who's been in the workforce for a number of years, has been displaced, and now needs new skills for the jobs of the future.
One of the important things I think both of you have mentioned several times is how all of these programs and ideas and policies have to work together. And I'm wondering, outside of affordability, what areas do you see as a priority for higher education policymakers in the coming years?
Well, again, higher education has to indeed anticipate the changing marketplace and the changing technologies and adjust their programs for those changes. And they have to do it uh, in collaboration with elementary and secondary education because, one of the problems that we have, particularly when it comes to community colleges, many of the students arrive without basic literacy skills and numerical skills that you would expect a high school graduate to have. So this has to be an integrated effort. The state has a much more fundamental responsibility, elementary and secondary. We have assumed a greater role at federal, but it has to be integrated. And as I said initially, integrated also into the jobs of the future. And the future's the future seems to be with us today. I mean, the change is so dramatic uh, that we have to continue to anticipate that. And so that's, I think, the ways that colleges can be very, very helpful, as always have.
I totally agree with Jack on that. I think we need a much closer relationship between academia and employers, and to make sure that we do understand what are the skills that are needed. The University of Maine's engineering department, which is truly exceptional, always is going out to employers and saying, what do you need from our engineers? And I remember at one point, there was a plant in southern Maine that makes aircraft parts, and they said, we need people who understand process engineering. So the university went out and hired a professor who could teach process engineering. That's the kind of collaboration that helps ensure that the graduates of our academic institutions have the skills that will allow them to get good jobs right off. I also think we need more apprenticeship programs. I'm a big believer in apprenticeship programs. I think that those can be extremely valuable, and they work best when there is collaboration between the employers, it may be even the equipment manufacturers, and the academic institution.
So given the proliferation of promise programs throughout the country, various states across the political spectrum really buying into the idea that there is a role for states to play in higher education to the benefit of the economy, how confident are either of you about the possibility to get good state buy-in to the PASS Act or to any of kind of the proposals that are being bandied about to create a stronger state-federal partnership?
Well, I think there is a very, very high probability of that. First of all, getting $2 for every $1 makes common sense to most people, and that's a part of our legislation. But also, I think they do understand, governors particularly, that they're in a global competition for jobs, for good companies coming into their states. And when you look at the decisions that companies are making, a lot of it is based upon the quality of the workers in that particular state. Do they have higher skills? And the skills, as Susan mentioned, are not just college skills; they're mechanical skills, manual skills. We do a lot of shipbuilding up in our way, and they can't find enough welders and good machinists, which is a lifelong career in these companies. They also need engineers, et cetera. So every governor I know of is out there trying to desperately attract the kind of investment that they need. And one of the biggest factors is, show me your education system from elementary all the way up through college. Show me your workforce. Show me what you've got. And I think that's the way to appeal to governors in terms of our program, is saying this is going to help you be more competitive in a very, very competitive global economy.
I agree. There's intense competition among states to get these investments, to get these employees, to get skilled tradespeople. And I think that they will be very interested in our proposal. But also, we've already talked to many of the players in the state of Maine about the PASS Act, and they're very interested in it. And many are very supportive of it. They liked the old LEAP program, and they were disappointed when the funding stopped in 2010, I think it was. And they would like to see a similar cooperative program be revived. And I think the PASS Act is even better.
I thought it was really important that both of you mentioned the role of industry and businesses in having a seat at the table and thinking about how to further help the development of the workforce. What in your mind should that look like in thinking about a federal approach to it? How do you get businesses and industry at the table to help with issues of apprenticeships or issues of workforce readiness?
Well, I've found them to be eager to come to the table, very eager, because I live in a state where the northern 2/3 of the state has lost a lot of population, particularly young people. And so employers are very eager to keep those young people. and to reskill older workers to meet the jobs that they have. And part of it is doing more raising of awareness of the job opportunities that exist and what a student needs to do in order to take advantage of those opportunities. The welders are a great example. We have the same shortage in my state. And I remember years ago securing funding for a community college in Northern Maine that started a precision machinist program. Well, they, to this day, have a 100% placement rate for everybody who goes through that program. I went to an apprenticeship program that trains people in the logging industry, and that had cooperation from a community college, from equipment manufacturers, from logging contractors. And it was just a great example of where everyone came to the table and developed this program to train people for good jobs, and also taught them, and I think this was equally important, how to do those jobs safely. And that was obviously in everyone's interest. So I think there will be great enthusiasm from employers because for the practical matter that they're desperate in many places to get skilled workers and employees who have the potential to really contribute to their organization.
No, I think Susan is exactly right. We have an example in Rhode Island where Electric Boat, which is our big submarine producer, collaborated with the Community College of Rhode Island and with the local Wesley school system to create a training center where individuals go learn welding and under the supervision of people who are Electric Boat as well as community college, and then go right onto the work floor at Electric Boat. Huge need. It's filling the demand of industry, and it's filling the demand for these young students to get a good long-term job. And I think more local leaders are beginning to recognize that. Based on the success here, we started another sort of incubator, if you will, up in Northern Rhode Island, not focused on those skills, but focused on skills more for the financial services industry, because we have a major fidelity institution there. And the colleges are working together, not just the community colleges, but also the four-year colleges. So that's beginning to sink through the local leaders. And I think our efforts can help stimulate that even more.
Thank you both so much for joining us today. I really appreciate you giving us some of your time. We're hoping our audience will stick with us and join us for a lively discussion with our panelists coming up right now. Please feel free to submit questions at your convenience so that we can get our panelists a point of view on all of those ideas. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, guys, thanks again for sticking with us. Joining us today, we have Dr. Shauna Jackson, the president of Nashville State Community College. We also have with us Dr. Wayne Lewis Jr., the president of Houghton College, and Michelle Streeter, associate director of policy and advocacy at the Institute for College Access and Success. Thank you all for joining us today. Dr. Jackson, let's start with you. The cost of attending public colleges has almost doubled in the last 20 years. How should states and the federal government address college affordability issues?
I think that Tennessee is a great model to look at. When I look at our tuition rates for our community colleges and technical colleges, in the last 10 years, it's only increased 4%. And since Tennessee Promise, which went statewide in 2015, has been implemented, we've averaged less than 1% increase in the last 5 years. So I think we have a very good model in Tennessee where there's a strong commitment from our state to have these Promise programs first for our traditional age students. And then in 2018, under Governor Haslam, we started a Tennessee Reconnect program. for our adult students. How it works, it's a last dollar scholarship. So students are required to fill out the FAFSA. And that has made Tennessee one of the top states in filling out the FAFSA each year with our high school students. And so the students are taking advantage of the money that was made available to them. And then we also have other programs like the Hope Lottery Scholarship for academic students. And then the Promise comes through as a last dollar scholarship. So we have a model that is working. It was a bipartisan effort led by Governor Haslam. And again, the commitment from the Tennessee Board of Regents, which our technical and community colleges are under, is to keep that tuition and fee rate very low so that we are able to continue to afford to do this program. For those not aware, we actually have a lottery endowment from lottery ticket sales that funds our Tennessee Promise programs. And so we are keeping up with the opportunity to keep this going for years and years in Tennessee, because the endowment is well over $300 million, but it averages about $30 million a year that we're putting towards our Promise programs. So I think Tennessee is a great state to look at as how we can make this affordable and keep rates low, because we're working together to make sure that families and students can continue to go on with their education.
I'd open it up to any of our other panelists if you have any ideas to share on this issue as well.
So I would share, Daniela, to Shauna's point, states have been really industrious in moving forward and developing these types of programs. And so the incredible opportunity I believe we have now is there is shared vision, bipartisan vision around the importance of increasing higher education attainment. There's shared understanding that earning degrees and earning credentials is absolutely essential in this economy for young people and not so young people. Where I think we're going to have some additional conversation is where is the appropriate balance between the federal and state relationships as we move forward? Because one, as states have developed some really innovative programs, I think we want to be really careful with any federal approach or any federal policy moving forward that it aligns with the good work that states have been doing and doesn't require that states have to go back and reinvent the wheel. The other reality that we have to discuss is that states have varying degrees of resources to take on something new or to make long-term commitments to funding new programs, right? States are in very different financial situations. And so that has to be a part of the consideration as well. So the federal investment is absolutely essential, but I believe there has to be as well enough latitude to permit states to continue with the great work that they've started.
Jump in here, it's really critical to hear the state perspective, and I'm happy to zoom out for just a minute and talk about where we see the federal government's role here. And as Dr. Lewis said, there is kind of an unprecedented window right now of bipartisan consensus on the need to invest more in higher education, college affordability, and closing equity gaps in college access and completion rates. And so how do we take advantage of this window? And there's certainly no magic bullet to address college affordability. And when we talk about affordability, I think it's also really important to say, we're not just talking about the cost of college and the cost of tuition. We're also talking about what needs to happen to provide more equitable access in general to a high quality, affordable college option, and to put resources toward not just getting a student enrolled or getting a student in the door, but also toward getting a degree completion or credential or whatever the student is seeking. And so I think a foundational piece of whatever a new partnership is between the federal government and states, that has to be to inject new federal funding into public colleges. And we talk so much, I think, about public colleges because they do enroll more than 3/4 of undergrads. So that is a really important piece of the system here. And we have to both kind of harness the spending power of the federal government while also bringing states back to the funding table and reversing the trend of state disinvestment. And all of this needs to be undertaken with a really explicit focus on closing the racial and economic equity gaps that we have seen persist in college completion rates. So we're not just reducing tuition costs, we need to reduce direct costs, all of the net costs, all of the kind of burden that goes into paying for and attaining a college degree, reducing debt burden, but also looking more holistically at what kind of direct coordinated partnership do we want to build here? There is currently no kind of statutory official funding partnership between the federal government and states for higher education. And so where can we kind of deploy the resources and the strengths of the federal government? They have the funding power, they have deficit spending power. I'm sure we'll talk more about that later. And state governments as well have a really important role to play, and they know their constituents and their residents better than the federal government ever could. And so I think that holistic approach is really what's needed to move the needle on not just affordability, but when we say affordability, we're talking about equity and we're talking about completion. And so kind of all of those things come together. And I also just want to say the word partnership is really important for this whole conversation again. Recognizing the variation across state systems, recognizing, the federal government, again, has certain things to bring to the table, but we really need to be intentional about bringing states to that table as well.
And if I may add, I think Michelle hit on something I want to make sure I echo, that Tennessee Promise really is an equality program. It is for everyone who is eligible, but it doesn't address the issues of equity. And even though tuition and fees are covered, we know that there are additional financial barriers, whether it's textbooks or just transportation, and then all of the holistic support services that I thought both senators did a great job of addressing, that there is more to consider than just the tuition and fees. And we certainly are looking to raise educational attainment, put people on a pathway to economic mobility, but closing the equity gaps is really the true goal.
I kind of want to touch a little bit more on the idea of state disinvestment, as Michelle brought up. I think we're at a point where we're seeing some states that are increasing their appropriations to their higher education systems. But as far as looking at the overall arching trend, we're not really back to pre-recessionary levels writ large. What are some of the factors that are contributing to the decline in state investment? And how do you think we start to really address this in a meaningful and sustainable way?
And I intentionally don't use the language disinvestment. But I would say, from my time serving in state government, states have really difficult decisions to make. And it is rarely, if ever, the case that a state is saying, I'm going to not fund higher education because I'm going to take those dollars and put them in a wasteful place. And it is much more often the case that states are making incredibly difficult decisions about how to use finite resources amongst a lot of different allocation possibilities, with all of them being incredibly important. With that said, I think it is incumbent upon us as advocates for higher education, and I would say as president of a private college, that private colleges have a major role to play in this as well. If we didn't have the graduates of private colleges, we'd be talking about a much different situation in terms of attainment. And so while not as large, a significant place. So as those advocates, it's important that we are clear about the value added for investment in our students, investment in our people, because that's truly what we're talking about. We're talking about investing in our students, investing in our citizens, investing in our future, and making it very clear that dollars invested in higher education are not about propping up the budgets of institutions, but they're about investing in the education and the skill development that our citizens need to continue to move our states forward.
You raise a really important point about the idea of investing in students rather than propping up the budget of institutions, which I think is a part of a messaging disconnect for some of the public. How do you really drill that home to the American taxpayer when the cost of college continues to rise and there's some sort of disconnect that they can't quite wrap their mind around? What, as college presidents, do you do to help people to understand that You are about educating the student, and that is your ultimate mission more than anything else.
Well, I can talk about Nashville State. One of the things that we have started saying is completion is not enough. You know, we've had this whole conversation about completion, retention, persistence, but post-completion success is what our college will be measuring. You know, did they actually transfer to a 4-year and actually graduate? Did we prepare them for the career? And how are they doing in that career? And so when you start being able to tell the story of the graduates and their success, in my opinion, they sell the value. And that is what we want to work with, to get our students and our employers being able to tell the success story of a college graduate. Often when you just tell a high school student, and sometimes even a working adult, you should go back to school. This will help you in the future. You know, it's short-sighted for them because they are dealing with their basic needs being met and what they need to do right then. But when you think about creating access, focusing on completion, yes, the holistic supports to get them there. But really, that's not the end goal. The end goal is economic mobility. The end goal is to complete maybe the 4-year credential and go into this workforce from there. And so that is something that we are focusing on in Nashville, is to really learn our graduates and get our alums and our employers to be the ones talking about what the value of education really is in the words that other students will understand.
I think President Jackson is spot on. It's our responsibility first and foremost to connect those dots for the taxpayers and to help them see very clearly the value in investing in students in post-secondary education, and walking across the stage, receiving that diploma, while an incredible accomplishment and worthy of all the celebration that we give it, that we have to talk about what comes next. As a result of investing in these students and students completing these programs, this is where it leads them in their lives. This is where it leads them in their careers. We have to be able to provide that. The other piece that I think the public and the taxpayer expects from us, reasonably so, is that we have some skin in the game. So as institutions, as a president of an institution, I do have a responsibility. Our board does have a responsibility to think about controlling costs, to recognize that the costs for higher education right now are astronomical. And I think students, rightfully so, families, rightfully so, expect us to be really intentional in controlling that cost and wherever possible, providing differentiated tuition, providing scholarship opportunities, reducing costs to students, supplementing the cost of operating our institutions in other ways other than just increasing tuition. That is our responsibility, and we have to come to the table with strategies in hand.
So I think it's fascinating. The PASS Act and the American Families Plan represent two approaches to improving affordability through increased state and federal investment. How, in your mind, are they similar? Where do they differ? What do you think they leave out?
I'm happy to start, Danielle. So I, both would do a lot of good, again, in kind of creating that statutory framework for a new coordinated relationship between states and the federal government to fund higher education. So I think that's really critical as kind of the policy goal that they are both looking to achieve through different mechanisms. So we see kind of the approach of the American Families Plan would include what we would call kind of an affordability guarantee or free college, whatever you want to call it, where essentially it becomes kind of another alternative mechanism to deliver direct aid to students to cover some portion of their tuition and costs. So that mechanism is a little bit different from what the PASS Act would do, which is a much more flexible kind of grant. It doesn't have that explicit affordability or tuition coverage guarantee, but instead is that much more flexible block grant approach. They do both include really important requirements around sending significant funds to directly cover student costs, but the PASS Act is generally looking more at how do we infuse state systems with additional resources while granting much more flexibility around what that means. And I think it is really important that both recognize a federal state funding partnership, whatever the form it takes, is an unprecedented opportunity to incentivize and equip states through funding to undertake all of these other key reforms that we know need to be put in place to make this succeed. So in addition to reducing net costs, you see other things around transfer agreements and evidence-based advising and student support services, and developing and equipping states to implement data-driven plans to address equity gaps in student completion rates. And so all of these kind of pieces around the policy mechanism are kind of similar in terms of what we want to incentivize states to do and what kind of outcomes we're looking for. I think the real discrepancy is between how much of the funding is directed toward direct tuition costs for students versus how much of it is kind of left up to the states as to what they want to do with that funding.
Is there anything that any of you think that is missing from either of these proposals that you would like to see greater focus and attention paid to as we move forward with more federal policy or even state policy?
I don't know that I would say missing, but I think Michelle is spot on in that there are different philosophical approaches to what the federal-state relationship or partnership would look like, and so that shouldn't be missed. Ultimately, it's something that we're going to have to grapple with as a nation, and think about what is the appropriate balance of that relationship. One of the things that I think is critically important, and President Jackson talked about this, is the importance of putting equity front and center in this conversation, and that there are lots of things that we can do, I think good things and things that we have done in higher education policy and higher education funding that don't necessarily address the issue of equity. So I am a staunch advocate for the Pell Grant. And I am fully supportive of any effort to increase the amounts. The double Pell efforts get me really excited. And one of the reasons they excite me so much is because there you are talking about targeting resources towards students who are in the greatest need. So my wife might get upset with me for saying this, Danielle, but my daughter doesn't need as much federal assistance in order to go to college as many other parents and families and kids would need across the country. And given that our resources are in fact finite at the state level and at the federal level, I do believe that as we decide how to allocate them, first and foremost, we should be thinking about how we get resources in the hands and the places where they're needed most. The Pell Grant does that, and I think there's room for us to continue to increase funding there to address some of these really long-standing equity, affordability, and access issues.
And I certainly agree with Dr. Lewis, and Michelle, you did a great job with analyzing the differences in the plan and what's common. That equity issue isn't just about money. And I do want to make a point in talking about what it doesn't address. The student that graduates from high school with a regular diploma, but reading on the 8th or 9th grade level, is going to have the same access to education as the student with the 30 on the ACT. But it's going to take different resources to support that student to completion. And so when we think about Tennessee Promise, I can definitely speak firsthand, boots on the ground, that it did open up the door for more students to access education. But what we found at the community college level is it was going to take a significant amount of resources to help those students be ready to continue on their education. And so there was a great hope that you would see massive amount of students coming, but that first year, fall to spring persistence, really was shocking. And so all of us are working very hard to create those additional supports that those students need. But that's something that's not addressed. It's still very much an inequality. We're going to open up the opportunity. We'll give more to people who need it based on income. But there are some other factors when we look at the things that have been systemic and equitable that need to be addressed as we put these plans in place.
Actually, can we stick to that kind of line of discussion about equity? I'd love to hear ideas from all of our panelists about ways in which we could address issues of equity from a policy standpoint. I mean, I think Pell is an interesting example, right? This is something that, arguably should be enough to get a lot of students through, but there are limitations, time limitations and such, it's semester limitations. And what we are starting to learn more about students is that they stop and start sometimes, and that starts to eat into their eligibility for Pell being able to complete. So are there other sorts of policies that you guys can think of that perhaps if we were to think about revising or addressing could go further towards addressing issues of equity?
Again, just at the institutional level, I'm not so sure that this is federal. It may be more state. In a response. Right now for Tennessee Promise, you must be a full-time student. And so the hope was that students would have their tuition and fees paid and not need to work as much. But we are not seeing that that is true. And so to have a full-time student trying to work 30 hours a week makes a difficult decision. Do I go to school or do I go to work? And so often they have to drop down to part-time, which then they lose their promise. So really trying to look at the lens of what is right for the student and what could best support that student in terms of, is it a hard fast, they must be full-time? Or are there occasions when that is not in the best interest for the student based on whatever else they may have going on? So I know there's sometimes limitations in how promise programs are put together, and I'm sure they vary across the state. I know that that is one that is very near and dear to my heart because 57% of my enrollment is part-time. And so that is pretty unusual in a more rural setting. I'm in a very urban market, and that is very difficult to graduate someone in 3 years if they're only going part-time, but they lose their promise and then they become cash paying students or hopefully Pell Grant. And then that causes that cycle of, I have to stop out a semester, save up enough money, come back the next semester. So looking at what the requirements are and thinking about that through the policy lens.
I agree. I would say finances and funding is definitely a major part of the equity conversation. But when we think about why we haven't reached the places of higher education attainment and skill attainment that we need to reach, financial resources is only part of it. And even with providing additional funding through Pell, through scholarships, through block grant dollars that go to states to be used, if we expect that populations of students and families that have been underserved for generations, we just give them the money, but then force them into the same traditional higher education system, the same traditional ways that we deliver higher education, the same traditional types of programs that are not aligned to current realities, workforce realities, and student and family realities, then we're not going to make the type of progress that we need to make. So as much as we want students to be adaptable and understand that they're coming into a new experience as post-secondary students, we as institutions, and I would say as state agencies as well, have to be adaptable to recognize that they're not often the traditional middle class student of today or yesteryear.
And I'm happy again to zoom out a little bit from the federal perspective, although I'm so much more interested in hearing from the college and state perspective. And as we know, the federal government is basically this big hammer. So when we're injecting a ton of new federal funding into something like higher education, we need to be really intentional and really careful about what levers we're pulling. And so I think, again, this is why it's really important that we account explicitly for what are the equity gaps that we are looking to close and how do we close them and how do we use evidence bases and research to make those spending decisions at the federal level, and then give states and institutions and local leaders kind of strike that balance and say, you are the ones on the ground, you are the ones working within this environment, and you know what your students need. And so how do we strike that balance between providing you the funding you need while also giving you kind of the space to to do what needs to be done. And so I think one piece I did want to mention is our research has demonstrated, especially declining, and I won't use the term state disinvestment, to Dr. Lewis's point, declining state support, especially in public higher education, it has exacerbated not only kind of declines for all institutions, but the inequitable spending patterns across institution types. So we know that institutions that serve more low-income students and students of color are always hit the hardest by state declining investment. And so things got really bad in the wake of the Great Recession, and we need to account for that particular discrepancy in resource allocation, and especially the hit that we saw during a downturn. And so we need from the federal side to say, how do we design this kind of hammer federal big spending approach to explicitly incentivize and equip states to say, this is the investment we need to make in our lowest income students. We don't need to just provide more financial aid, although that is critical, but we also need to provide wraparound services. We need to enable students. I'm always loath to use the term non-traditional student, because I think it's, a student is a student, and I want to, a student who is not the kind of 18 to 24, no other responsibility, living on campus. Those students are not necessarily the ones that we need to be focused most on getting across the graduation stage and into the workforce. So how do we enable those students to enroll while working, while caring for children, while caring for other family members, while managing other life responsibilities? And how do we say, as the federal government, we're going to give states this big new funding injection, but we're also going to kind of hold them accountable for serving these students in the ways that they know best how to do.
We actually have an audience question, very exciting, kind of sticking to Michelle's point about wraparound services. Frank Balmain on YouTube asks, can the panelists talk about the importance of wraparound service like mentoring in Tennessee Promise, TRIO, childcare, emergency grants, broadband access? Open to anyone.
Well, absolutely. Just to clarify, with the Tennessee Promise program, when a student is still in high school, they are assigned a community mentor. It is a volunteer program. I've been a mentor for many years, but it's not the same formal mentoring program that you might be thinking of. So I just wanted to make sure that that was clear. That's to help the student have a point person to just ask questions to, and to make that process of little nudges. Don't forget to fill out your FAFSA, don't forget to apply, and just to know that they have a resource. At Nashville State, we have been laser focused on building holistic support services for students. Since I arrived in 2018, we've opened up a food pantry, we've created a student success center, we're about to stand up a one-stop welcome center. It is my opinion that the student shouldn't have to navigate the college. We should make it easy for students to navigate. So those early connection points, creating that sense of caring and a culture of belonging just really goes a long way to helping people advocate that, hey, I need help, who do I go to? So I think that what we are hoping we can do is make the support inescapable. Like, you can't help but get help at Nashville State. And that is going to take a while because each student needs something different. So we're personalizing the experiences based on what the students need. But those academic and non-academic supports are critical for all students, but particularly those that have been marginalized.
One of the examples I share for Houghton is one of our programs in Buffalo, where we are serving a population that is primarily not the traditional student population. And so in addition to providing a really high touch experience for students and really walking shoulder to shoulder to students to navigate the internal college processes, that program operates out of the King Urban Life Center on the east side of Buffalo, which is also a hub for other services. And so it's not just a matter of pointing students to community resources and community services, but really handing them off to them and walking students to those resources, because we know to provide the type of experience that students need to be successful, it takes more than just sending a link by email or handing them a pamphlet.
Thank you, guys. This was a really lively and great discussion. I greatly appreciate all of you giving us so much of your time to talk about this important issue. We are done for today, and I again appreciate your time and hope we can continue on thinking about state and federal investments and partnerships.